Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War, and we are happy tonight to have historian Gary Ecelbarger joining us to talk about a new book that I believe just came out a few months ago, and it's called George Washington's Momentous Year, and it's going to focus as a Washington fan. I'm very excited about getting a chance to learn more about this book and get my own copy so I can actually read it. It's a focuses on really one of the momentous years of Washington's life from July of 1777. And I believe it's going to be two volumes. It's going to go into July of 1778. But we're really glad to have Gary on here with us. And first thing I'm going to ask is, Gary, I know I'm familiar that you've written a lot of books about the Civil War. I'm interested in really what drew you to this particular year and this particular story, and kind of what got you into wanting to write about this topic.
Okay, well, thanks first to Emerging Revolutionary War for inviting me on. I enjoy your podcasts. I enjoy your work, Mark, and I'm really glad to be a part of this. And of course, I like to talk about my book. So, uh, my start in well, if you're asking about my start in my Revolutionary War interests, it actually I would say even preceded my Civil War interest. My first book I wrote was an unpublished thing that I wrote for my family back in the early 90s, which was my family history from the Revolutionary War to the birth of my grandparents. And I have 10 or almost a dozen now direct ancestors that I've found that served in the Revolutionary War, mostly militia, but it still counts. so, so I really had read a lot about the Revolution at that time. My first books that I was writing were more in the 19th century, Civil War era, and biographies of participants in the Civil War and Western exploration. But I never lost my interest in the Revolution. I just didn't feel as comfortable to write about it at that time. So but I was running tours on of Revolutionary War campaigns as early as 2005. I get hired out by a lot of different touring companies, and I do a lot of work for them. So I remember doing Philadelphia campaign tours as early as 2005. So I always had a foot in it, which meant I was always doing some research on it, collecting letters, knowing that down the road I would do a project on this. My late father was a huge George Washington fan, and I really didn't appreciate George Washington as probably as much as he wished I did. I've certainly admired him because a lot of my tours, for example, had him in mind as well. But I really glommed onto this idea when I was debating about doing a campaign, writing a book about a campaign from the perspective of headquarters. And to be honest, I originally thought of this idea with a Civil War general because I felt more comfortable managing around Civil War campaigns at that time, not doing the deep dive into these Revolutionary War campaigns. And it just became natural as I was doing another one of my Revolutionary War tours and talked it over with my tour group that Washington was the perfect subject for this because, of course, who's in his headquarters? People like Hamilton and Lawrence, and at times floating in and out, people like Lafayette. So, which meant that there was a lot of documentation out of headquarters, and that was the story to tell. The only thing that came close to it, I think, that had already been what I would call previously published was probably Douglas Southall Freeman's volumes on Washington, but you know they're about 70 years old now. It could use an update, and a lot of it was attended to be from Washington's headquarters. But there's a lot of new material that came out since then, so I knew I had a new story to tell. And then you were
Yeah.
asking, what was the other question was why that period, July to July? Well,
Mm-hmm.
specifically, it's July 4th to July 4th. So the first the first time that George Washington recognized independence was when he was in the New York campaign in 76. And I think it was on July 8th that he gave his men a gill of rum. All right. So he did recognize it. But the first 4th of July celebration, remember, it could have been celebrated on July 2nd, as John Adams would have thought it was going to be, but it was 4th of July. I I had done I had done research on all the different states and how they were celebrating it. They all chose the 4th of July. It wasn't a national commitment. It was all done by the states separately. And in places like Philadelphia, it was a decision that was made just 2 days before.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I found that every single state had a huge celebration. For example, in Charleston, they had a 76 gun salute out of Fort Moultrie, 76, followed by infantry firing a 13 gun salute with the toast. But every single state was having that. So I was stunned when I saw that George Washington, who was in camp at Morristown at that time, he had just circled back from his wintertime quarters and came back. He was monitoring William Howe's movements out of New York City, wondering which way he was going to go. And he was so consumed by this that he never even mentioned it, never mentioned the 4th of July. And nobody in his headquarters, in their preceding letters or post letters or their diary entries, ever mentioned the 4th of July in 1777, the first celebration of the 4th of July. Now, fast forward 1 year later, 4th of July, 1778, on the banks of the Raritan River, George Washington had a massive military pageant celebration of the 4th of July with the feu de joie, with the firing down the lines, all the cannons going off. Howe's men heard it when they were embarking from Sandy Hook over 20 miles away. So this was a huge celebration at what is now Rutgers University, right on the banks of the Raritan. And so my story is what happened in that year that made George want to celebrate it so much in 1778. And that's how the book took off.
That's amazing. Yeah, you always,
Yeah.
obviously, yeah, Fourth of July is always celebrated, and I always found it interesting to see how it was commemorated at the time. I think it's great, yeah, to think about specifically Washington and his army, how they viewed those anniversaries. And yeah, no, I mean, in Washington, having written about Trenton and Princeton, I feel like there's a lot of focus on Washington in that 1776 era. There's a lot of focus on him, especially in the Yorktown campaign.
Right.
But yeah, these years in between, especially what this book covers, Brandywine, Germantown, I feel like are often overlooked. But partly probably because they weren't great military victories for Washington. But yet at the same time, it's such a crucial time period that had huge reverberations on the course of the war. I love that you mentioned Douglas Southall Freeman's work because yeah, I feel like that is kind of the standard biography of looking at it, like you said, from a command decision perspective of what Washington knew at the time and how he was taking in that information and making his decisions. So is that kind of how this book or these books are going to focus um, uh, on these campaigns from the Philadelphia campaign?
Yeah, well, let me add another more recent approach to this. I would say Ed Langle's book, George Washington: A Military Life, which I think came out 2012, 2013. Forgive me if I had the year wrong, but I think that's the book. He has a couple chapters on it, and in on the campaign that I covered, but not a book length treatment. And in Freeman, I think it's part of volume 4, the end of volume 4, and part of volume 5 that covers the whole year that I'm taking. So I'm doing it as just 2 separate volumes. And what I'm learning from the headquarters perspective is that, and this is coming from somebody who's written military history from in the Civil War. I'm learning that when I go back and start writing Civil War books again, I'm going to focus a lot more on headquarters personnel as well, because the approach I'm taking with this is trying to cover the campaign in real time, and you can almost look at it as a military campaign biography of 1 year of George Washington's life. So everything's focused on what's going around him, but not losing sight of the campaign itself. Now, the Philadelphia campaign has a lot of fairly recent, wonderful books about it. I just mentioned to you that I did my first tour of the Philadelphia campaign I think in 2005. Now I feel a little sorry for that tour group because that was before Tom McGuire's books came out. And so what I covered in future tours was based a lot on his new history. And then of course Michael Harris with his volumes has added to our knowledge from there. So my attempt wasn't to reinterpret the campaign. But what I think all those authors, and Mike would admit to this too, is his focus wasn't going to be on George Washington. And you learn a lot about the campaign by understanding what did George know, when did he know it, what did he do about it. And when you take the campaign from that step forward, how headquarters interacts during a battle, in between battles, marching from one campsite to another, the little machinations that are going on, the reading between the lines and the letters, as you will, you get to really understand how the whole operation works. But it also gives you a new insight into what goes on in the campaign. And Philadelphia campaign is a perfect example. I think you're right. I think we tend to lose a little sight of it because unlike Yorktown, we don't think about it as a victorious campaign at all, or like Trenton, Princeton, of course, which you've written about, because it's that in-between campaign, and he lost battles in that campaign, of course. However, the way I'm looking at it now, and I didn't go in thinking about this, but as I was writing it, seeing the impact, for example, that the Battle of Germantown had on the big decision makers overseas, the future French alliance, I realized how much they counted on George Washington making a strike, even if it wasn't a battle victory. So Germantown had such a huge impact on their decision making that it wasn't just Saratoga that made the difference. It was George Washington surprise attacking Howe at Germantown on October 4th, 1777, that people like John Adams, probably one of the biggest curmudgeons of the war, admitted that Germantown might have had more influence on the French alliance than even Saratoga. So that's the way that we need to consider this. Now, I didn't put this in the book, Mark, but I was thinking about it, and I just don't have the evidence for it. The question that now pops in my head is: did George Washington plan a battle that way? Did he plan on the impact that it would have on eyes that were watching overseas? We know that when I'm writing volume 2, the Monmouth campaign certainly has that influence, but did the Philadelphia campaign have that? And I didn't have enough evidence for me to feel comfortable enough writing about it in volume 1, but it's still tingling in the back of my head that maybe he had planned that particular battle that way, because he didn't plan to go into Philadelphia. He just planned to strike at Germantown and then withdraw from the battlefield. You know, my evidence is for that, and this isn't focused on, the wagons didn't go with him. He put a check on himself that not to get carried away. If they routed the army at Germantown, and they initially did, and then the British Army held its ground. They actually had a wonderful day. They were very professional soldiers out there. When Washington struck them, if he had completely routed that 9,000 enemy force out of Germantown, I have no evidence at all that he planned to go to Philadelphia, because he didn't bring his wagons with him. He had to withdraw sooner or later. So you wonder if that strike was made with the idea, hey, let's just show them I'm still around, but also anybody watching this that has that, meaning France, know that I'm always going to be there. I'm always going to be a thorn in his side.
Yeah. No, yeah, you have to imagine, yeah. So I guess, yeah, that's something that the book also looks into, because I know during this time period, I mean, there's a lot of politics going on in
Right.
the army, and in the Congress and everything else. And yeah, because obviously the foreign powers are watching closely everything that's going on over here. Yeah, were you able to tease out? I know in uh, Monmouth studies, they, how important that campaign really was in, solidifying Washington's presence as the commander in chief. Yeah, did you find a lot of this political infighting within the army and within the Congress, specifically as it relates to Washington and him trying to basically keep his job as commander in chief?
Well, it's for those that will read volume 1, they'll see that the start of what we'll know as the cabal. We call it the Conway Cabal, but it was a true cabal. Read Mark Lender's book Cabal. You'll see that the Board of War was definitely trying to usurp Washington's power and undermine him, which I will cover more in volume 2. The start of it begins in volume 1, where he actually had an enemy in his front and a brewing enemy in his back, with what the Board of War was already deciding, making some decisions and putting new people on the board. That will be more developed in volume 2. I'll have a little different take on Monmouth. A little preview, a hint, is I kind of go against the grain on this. Washington's reputation didn't need to be solidified in the Monmouth campaign, so I don't think. I think Washington's decision to fight at Monmouth, and the battle that he plans, had less of a political import than it was just his need to make a strike for his new army, which I'll develop more as you see it in volume 2. I'll kind of leave it there, but I don't think it was there to seal his reputation, because I think he had already successfully tamped down the cabal while at Valley Forge. So there was no question. There was one commander in chief. Gates was already working as his subordinate. That was all clarified. There was no need to battle for that purpose in my research, and it's what'll be portrayed in volume 2. But in volume 1, all the way into the start of volume 2, which will be the Valley Forge encampment, you'll see that drawn out even a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I always think that's the like you said, having an enemy in front of him, but then also having
Right.
like the secure his spot. And yeah, and like we mentioned, you talk about Germantown, how his army strikes, and then it's ultimately forced back. And then Brandywine, of course, from your study, typically what I've read is, Washington, I mean, he makes a lot of mistakes in his campaign at Brandywine to try and prevent, doesn't do enough to guard his flank, allowing the British to outflank him and push his army back. What's kind of your take on Washington's decision making ability at Brandywine? Do you think he made big mistakes there? Kind of how do you view it from your writing?
Well, it shouldn't be a surprise to you to know that I'll have a different take on it. His biggest mistake in the Philadelphia campaign will be on a non-battle day, and we can get to that a little later. But at Brandywine, I demonstrate, and I've now put this in some presentations. It wasn't a loss due to misinterpretation of intelligence or not looking out for his flank. It was him being on a river-sized creek with so many crossings on it that Howe was inevitably going to get across it. And it was just a matter, again, of coming. It's, again, what you have to realize when, to make a long story short, if you think of his army, which is covering by road up to 10 miles of the Brandywine. All right. So armies don't automatically transfer. So if you have to commit troops to a flank, it takes time for untrained divisions to move up and to deploy it from one end to the other. So you don't want to overprotect a flank and leave your middle wide open, or vice versa, right? So he had stretched out his force almost to the point where Sullivan, and Mike Harris talks about this in his book very minutely, Sullivan is down to single regiments covering the upper fords. And what needs to be realized is that when Howe starts moving up on the Great Valley Road, everybody in every history I've ever read said, well, if you had dragoons on the Great Valley Road, Washington would have known about this and put more troops, for example, at the upper fords that weren't covered. And the answer is no. You got to wait till Howe passes the last ford that Sullivan is covering before you commit to the next ford, or else you're going to strip troops from your center. And I don't think anybody's ever written about it that way before. So if you look at it that way, that time means that he has to be sighted at a certain time. The courier has to notice it right away, get the dispatch back to Washington. Again, it's when did he know it? what did he know and what did he do about it? This all happened. The Howe was sighted moving past the last ford that Sullivan was covering at 9:30, 10 o'clock. That dispatch has to go back 6 miles.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't happen. There's no telegraph here, right? It's courier on a horse. So by the time Washington gets it and reacts to it, he immediately sends 2 divisions, 4 brigades, in an effort to head to the upper ford to cover it. Then he gets some misinformation, which, long story short, that actually works in his favor because he had overcommitted troops to go after Kniphausen's center line force and then ended up drawing him back. So Howe was still going to have avenues to go up even 1 more mile to the next ford and 1 mile to the next ford after that. And I talk about this minutely in the narrative of the chapter that I bring this up in. And it's not an easily covered thing. I think it was inevitable that Washington was going to have a battle on his side of the river, just depending on what height it was going to be on. Was it going to be on Birmingham Heights? Was it going to be on Osborne Hill? It was going to be inevitable. And the reason why he lost that battle was Howe struck Sullivan's men at the right time and rolled them up while Sullivan, as commander of all 3 divisions, was conferring off to the right with the other 2 division commanders, and his second in command didn't know what he was doing. And it's a whole long story that's covered well in several other books. It just rolled those guys up. So the other thing too is I've been told that Washington didn't put enough of a force on Birmingham Hill. Well, again, look at the dispatches. He learned that 4,000 to 5,000 men were on Howe's flank march. Now, Howe really had 9,000 officers and men, but the intelligence that Washington received was that it was 4,000 to 5,000 with 16 cannons. So he put 6,000 men on Birmingham Heights, each division with its own set of cannons. Seems like that's an adequate coverage for that potential attack that could occur there. And it wasn't. I mean, Howe rolled it up before he even deployed everybody, but Howe would have overwhelmed him eventually there.
Yeah. No, I think that's fascinating. Yeah, I feel like there's that typical narrative of, oh, he should have had somebody up at that upper ford, but
Right.
like saying, but then it'd just be the next. I mean, how many fords are you going to cover?
Right. There's one more fort. There's one fort. We're talking about he's going to cross Trimble's Ford. Because Howe has a high ground. He would blow away any force that tried to cover it there. I do tours up there and show them from the American side of Trimble's Ford. It'd be crazy to think that you're going to protect that ford. And it's the less dominant stream of the river. You can splash across it. The other ford, Jaffaris's Ford, we call it Jeffrey's Ford, but it's Jaffaris's Ford, 3 feet deep. And the high ground is in the Americans' favor. So in hindsight, you say, well, he could have put a force on Jaffaris's Ford, but there's one more ford, 1 more mile up, which has a bridge over it today over Route 322, and that was called Taylor's Ford. And Howe could have circled around Washington's defense at Jaffaris's Ford and worked his way down, and Washington would have just had a waste of extra infantry and artillery that would have done nothing. So there's just no way to stop him, is my conclusion in all that. Howe would have found a way around it. Yeah.
I mean, the flank march in itself is, I mean, pretty impressive.
It is. Oh, yeah.
And yet, having the expectation that Washington is going to, I think that's something that, oh, he should have done this, or, that Monday morning quarterbacking. And that's why I really appreciate you taking it in that same kind of Freeman way of what did he know when did he know it? Because you can't judge people based on, what we know today. You have to judge it based on what he knew.
Right. And a lot of times, some of our evidence there runs on this notion that the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. And the notion was, since there were no dragoon reports in the morning, that Washington misused his dragoons on the day of the battle and didn't have them scouting out the roads. Absolutely incorrect. Okay. In fact, the day before, on September 10th, he is sending a message back to Congress, which is 25 miles behind him now. And he tells them that his scouts have told him that Howe is across the Brandywine on the Lancaster Road on one direction, and south of him, crossing at Wilmington from the south. Now, how's he getting that information? Not infantry. That's 15 miles above him and 10 miles below him. It's cavalry. Of course, it's cavalry. So to think that he used his cavalry all through December 10th, but all of a sudden had them brigaded where the visitor center is and didn't use them all in the morning of September 11th is ridiculous. Okay. In fact, there is sources that showed he actually had some cavalry between the two forks of the road of the branching of the Brandywine at the start of the contest anyway. And he had what he thought was a capable militia officer to warn him as well. But he was warned about the flank march even before Howe reached the first crossing at Trimble's Ford, and he reacted to it. That's all you need to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you said that the mistake was made before, or you said it was not a battle. It wasn't
Oh,
a
yeah.
battle. Tell us a
Well,
little bit about that. So.
well, thanks for reminding me on that. Okay, so um, we'll bring it up to speed. It's actually after the battle. All right. So, um, and if you allow me a little leeway, I'll get you to this. so he 2 days after the battle, he has pulled his army over this military bridge that they made over the Middle Ferry, and he's on the Philadelphia side of the Schuylkill River. And what bothered me for 20 years, Mark, and nobody asked the question, and it always bothered me, but I was asking it in my first tour, why do you cross the Schuylkill? I mean, to put 15,000 plus men over a river one day and then recross them 24 hours later, this time over a ford, that's a lot of time and energy. Why in the world would you do that? You can access the road that they ended up on without having to cross the river. Why would they do that? And I learned that he had a council of war the night in between, and the generals, maybe not unanimously, but certainly by the majority, said we want another crack at Howe. And so I found evidence of that council of war. And of course, Washington is the idea that he was a Fabian tactician here is nonsense. He was going after to attack Howe. So he recrosses the river. He mentions 7 times that his reason for recrossing isn't to protect Reading Furnace or anything or Reading, Pennsylvania, or the furnaces. It's to go after Howe. And that led to the non-battle, the Battle of the Clouds, which was stopped by a huge torrential nor'easter. And then Washington will move his men essentially 46 miles in 2 days. An incredible march, much like a Stonewall Jackson type of march, right, in the Civil War. And he gets them on the American or on the Philadelphia side of the Schuylkill River, which is kind of running east to west. This is the area around Valley Forge now, and Washington's on the north side of the river, and he has blocked Howe. Now, this is where you have to appreciate Howe as well. We always learn that Howe is a passive commander and he lets Washington go in 1776. Not the case in 77, because when he learns that Washington is north of him, he could easily if his objective is to capture Philadelphia, he's got a 15-mile bloodless route to get into the city. He knows the ford that Washington crossed his army over. It's now essentially unprotected. He can just capture the city on September 16th. He doesn't do that. He decides to go right after Washington in a 2-pronged attack. That led to the Battle of the Clouds. He was trying to annihilate George Washington. He was trying to end the revolution right there. But now he's overcommitted. And now Washington's got him blocked. So think about this. Washington has 10 crossings of the Schuylkill River covered on the night of September 20th. And Howe has to make a decision. He either has to force across the river, taking a lot of casualties at one of the crossings, or he's going to have to give up the campaign and drop all the way back down to Wilmington, or even if there's still any supplies at the head of Elk, he's got to go back 40 to 60 miles. He's got a 15,000 man army that only had a certain amount of supplies in their wagons. He's already been committed in this campaign for almost a week and a half, and he's overcommitted. And Washington has all those crossings blocked, all 10 of them. And on the 21st, for reasons Mike Harris and I still talk about this all the time. We don't know why Washington did this, but he got over concerned about having his right flank turned, or now he's worried about a threat to Reading, and he pulls his entire force from all 10 of those crossings and opens up the Schuylkill to Howe. And overnight on the 22nd, 23rd, uncontested, Howe will cross the Schuylkill. It takes him 13 hours to cross his entire army. Just think if he had a resistance there. It just never could have happened. That was Washington's biggest mistake. He let Howe cross that river, and he had him dead to rights. It was almost checkmate. And I still don't really appreciate the reason why Washington did it. He floated around a few ideas like Howe conducted a feint and it fooled him, but there is no evidence of any feint. I even wrote an article on this, the feint that never happened, which there's just no evidence that there was a feint. And why would Washington commit the whole army to a feint and not leave the ford covered? But he did, and that's how Howe captured Philadelphia on September 26th. And that
Yeah,
was what. So Washington on September 21st made his biggest mistake of that campaign. Yeah.
huh. Yeah, no, you often hear, yeah, Brandywine, and yes, I mean, oftentimes Battle of the Clouds is very much overlooked. And then you also, yeah, like this whole story of the potential of another battle for Philadelphia is
Right.
really fascinating to think
Think
about.
about the desperation that Howe was facing. If he's got to make this huge decision, what he's got to try to force a crossing. How can you
Mhm.
do that, right? The high ground's on the north side. He's not gonna be able to use his artillery effectively to knock him back. So
Mhm.
Washington just opened the gate for him essentially. So
Well,
that was his biggest mistake.
I think it's really fascinating too. You talking about how offensively minded Washington
Yes.
was, because yeah, like you said, I mean, he's typically militarily, depicted as yeah, falling back and yeah, doing these small strikes when necessary. But
And letting him go, right? Right.
right,
And
yeah,
maybe there's some truth to that in 1776, but in 77, that evidence that Howe knew that that ford was there, he was notified about it, and in the afternoon of September 15th, and he sends orders to Cornwallis's wing division that's closer to that river, but he doesn't send him to the river to cross it. He sends him northward, and he sends him 2 hours after sunset, essentially, to start marching at 8 o'clock. Why in the world do you march at 8 o'clock at night? It's not to cross the river at Swedesford, which is 16 miles further north. It's because he's trying to capture Washington and his army in an unsuspecting little segment of the Lancaster Road, and Washington's looking for him. So the Battle of Clouds, which would have been a really interesting contest, were two armies looking for each other to battle each other. It wasn't a chance meeting at all. They were both going for each other,
no,
and
and I
they
think it's
and they
also
found each other. Yeah,
that's well, it's interesting too. You talk about these objectives of
right.
are you going for the city or are you going for the army? It reminds me of during the American Civil War, this whole thing of do you capture Richmond or are you going after Lee's army? And the importance of getting at the actual army, and the story of a lot of the Philadelphia campaign is the preservation of Washington's army, how important that is.
Right.
But the
But in
fall of Philadelphia was also a major blow as well. So
yeah, because if you think about it, throughout the spring and summer of 77, when Washington's on the Jersey side and Howe can't move off from the Raritan because Washington's in the hills and can strike his flanks, that's when Howe decides, and he writes this to Germain as early as April, I think it's April 2nd, that he plans to do it by sea. And when Washington meets him, when Howe lands at Head of Elk, and Washington confronts him at Wilmington, all up until this point, Washington's army's between Howe and Philadelphia. So when Howe says my mission is Philadelphia, it's a twofer, meaning that I'll get Washington and his army and then go into the city. He didn't have to say my objective is George Washington because one would come with the other because he knows that Washington's going to block the city. But that's why the Battle of the Clouds mini campaign, as we'll call it, is so fascinating because Washington interposes his army no longer between Howe and Philadelphia, but 20 miles north of Howe, baiting him in essence. Is Howe going to go for Washington or is he going to go for Philadelphia? And that's why Howe should be considered, just like Washington, an aggressive minded gambler. Is that I'm going to end the revolution right now, not by capturing Philadelphia, but by destroying that guy and his army. And that's why he went after him. And
huh,
that has never really been fleshed out before.
yeah,
Everybody thinks it was just a chance meeting. that Howe is on his way to Swedesford, for example, and bumped into Washington, who was going out to protect Reading or the furnaces, and that's nonsense. That's not how it happened at all.
Huh. That's really fascinating. Yeah, and like often when I talk about this time period to people, I talk about how yeah, in European warfare, I mean, capturing the opponent's political capital. I mean, and in this case, the largest city in America. What kind of reaction did Washington and his army have to that? Was it a severe, more morale blow to them, or did they, how much of an impact did they have? Because I know he's going to come at them at as you mentioned at Germantown, and like you said, he's not going to recapture the whole city, but what kind of psychological impact does that have on Washington and his army? Do they think it's all lost at that point, or are they still committed to just keeping up the fight?
Well, what's amazing about about the Continental Army, and I can compare this to Civil War armies and campaigns when it looks like they're in losing campaigns. I'm I am absolutely impressed at the morale that's just stays elevated in those Continentals, and it's a new army. And Mark, you know this because after Trenton Princeton, much of that army's dissolved. There's maybe out of Washington's 1777 army, maybe there's a corps of 2,500 men that were veterans of 76. But when Washington's army grows by the time of White Marsh, let's say, to 24,000, which is the second largest population center in the country now, at 24,000. Most of these guys are 1977 recruits. Very few of them had experience before that. So it's incredible to see that even after Brandywine, you don't see a lot of desertions early on when they're doing these huge marches. They have avenues of escape, and I don't see that kind of desertion, for example, that I see in Civil War campaigns. Like even Jackson's victorious army in the Shenandoah Valley campaign, in some brigades, he had 50% desertions going on in a 21-day period. That wasn't occurring in Washington's army. Their morale, even after Brandywine, was fairly positive. Now, there were people after Washington's big mistake of letting Howe cross that realized that was a mistake. And you see letters from delegates in Congress and from people in the army that this was even some questioning of Washington's decision within his own military family. People like his adjutant general Timothy Pickering, who's definitely a Washington critic throughout this. So we have to sometimes temper some of his comments, but in this case, I think he was appropriate talking with Nathaniel Greene. And you see that they're really questioning why Washington's making this kind of decision. That's all wiped out again by Germantown. It is without a doubt the most interesting battle loss I've ever seen, because every single comment from the losing side is extremely positive. They were so thrilled to see redcoats turning their backs to them in the early part of the battle. The light infantry battalion that was knocked off of Mount Airy, that just thrilled the heck out of these guys, even though they ended up being forced from the battlefield at the end of the day. So their morale stayed very high, and Congress even stamps out a medal to George Washington after Germantown, which they knew was a loss, congratulating the performance of he and his men at Germantown. So,
Really?
yeah, that's exactly how it was. And for Howe, and I know I'm butchering the line. You probably know it better than me, but when in Paris, when Benjamin Franklin learns that Howe has captured Philadelphia, he says, "No, I believe Philadelphia has captured him." Remember that line? Well, because the forts had not been captured yet, so he doesn't have an avenue to bring his supplies in, right? So you would think that when Forts Mercer and Mifflin fall in mid-November, that the impact of Philadelphia is more promising to Howe. But Mike Harris, who writes about this in his next coming book, and I'm bringing it up now as well, is that it still doesn't solve his supply woes, because when he embarks on the White Marsh campaign in early December, 3 weeks after the forts are now in his possession, he goes up in that campaign with 100 empty forage wagons. He's actually embarking on White Marsh to knock Washington off the hills so that he could probably forage freely in Bucks County behind them, and which makes it that campaign very disastrous for Howe, that he has to come back to Philadelphia and then send another reconnaissance in force with more forage wagons 2 days later. So Howe is never comfortable capturing Philadelphia because he knows his army isn't settled in yet and doesn't have a good supply line at that stage.
Huh. Just quickly going back to Germantown real quick. I got a question. The that battle, as you mentioned, it starts out this American victory. They're driving the British back, and then Washington they make the decision to attack the Chew Mansion there at Cliveden. Is that in your writing, is that the big mistake of Washington at Germantown that's often portrayed as?
I think it was a big it basically defined the length of the battle, but I think it merely enhanced the inevitable.
Mm.
I don't think they were going to win that battle before they diverted their forces to the Chew House, because
Mm.
Howe's men held. And remember, the Americans start retreating before Cornwallis comes up from Philadelphia with 2,000 plus men. And I think if Washington had stayed in line and Cornwallis comes up and hits him with those 2,000, the retreat would have been horrendous. As it turns out, they were able to retreat in good order. They took all their cannons off, unlike Brandywine, where they lost almost a dozen cannons. And I don't think they lost that many men on the retreat. Washington had a good rear guard fighting set up by Wayne, for example, at White Marsh. I mean, they did retreat 25 miles. I'm not going to discount that. But remember, I think Washington's plan was to strike, win at Germantown, and then fall back to his wagons, which were 16 miles away.
Yeah.
So it just happened earlier than he expected to. Now he took 2-1 losses, and that's typical by military doctrine. The attacking force takes at least twice as many casualties as the defending force. That's no surprise. But what you got to realize about Germantown, when everybody criticizes Washington and his over elaborate plan, if you read Mike Harris's Germantown book, he'll like the fact that I keep plugging his works, right? He does kind of state that they all really attacked at the same time. Let me bring one more point in there. I think this will be very impressive. At one time in the battle, when you count militia brigades and the Continental brigades, there will be 13 brigades hitting the Crown Force defensive line at the same time. They don't all strike at exactly the same time, pretty close, but at one point in the battle, they're all striking at the same time by design. That was the plan. Come on, four roads, hit. Those 13 brigades in officers and men was over 13,000. It was probably closer to 14,000. Let's just split the difference and say 13,500, right? 13,500. That is without a doubt to that date the greatest assault ever that occurred on American soil. It will be the greatest assault for the rest of the Revolution, and it won't be topped again for 84 years until the second year of the Civil War. That's how massive that assault was at Germantown, and that's Washington's very aggressive battle plan. So get the notion of a Fabian strategy out of your head. He is an offensive tactician. That's his design.
Yeah, no, and I know he does that even, at Trenton and Princeton, where he does come
Yep.
up with very elaborate, multiple divisional strikes across,
And they
miles.
work. And they work
Yeah.
to some degree.
I mean, and it is interesting, yeah, how, I mean, in Germantown, I mean, it is, I mean, there's all sorts of factors that also led into with the fog and the confusion and all that kind of stuff.
It worked in their favor early on, and then it worked against them later. And we can't disregard the professionalism of the Crown Force soldier in that battle. They really need to get a lot of credit because they weren't on high ground. They were folding on their right with Greene's attack, and they basically bent into this reverse L, right? Reverse number 7, and they still held on to that position. So they need to get a lot of credit.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier too, I mean, I think yeah, Germantown's always overshadowed by Saratoga. But as you mentioned, there are lots of records that, yeah, the French were paying attention closely to what Washington and his army was doing. And the very fact that after Brandywine, after the fall of Philadelphia, that Washington and his army are capable of doing this kind of battle, I think, yeah, it plays a big role in France coming on board, which of course changed the whole war as well. So
Yeah, and think of it this way, because it is a little short-sighted to say. I mean, of course, the surrender of Burgoyne and 5,900 plus soldiers is a big deal. But if the Grand Army, which just happens to be operating in the Middle Department, isn't doing well, that why in the world would France commit to the war if the main army isn't doing so well, and the Northern Army, of which Washington's detached so many of his generals and some of his expert troops like Morgan's riflemen, if they're not performing well, why would they recognize them? So of course they have to see that Washington's performing well. Now critics of this would say, well, that it was a great spin, right? Propaganda that had France fooled that Washington was did well at Germantown, because they said after the battle, the negotiators like Franklin and Dean and Arthur Lee were convincing their negotiators in France when they were talking to Vergennes that Washington had 15,000 men after the battle, and they said no, he only had 12,000. That's what critics would say today. No, he really did have 15,000 men. And remember, these negotiations are, because there's such a long delay to get that news across. They're talking about this at the start of December. So if you could actually have instantaneous messaging, and if France said, well, what does Washington look like in early December? And they realized that after Germantown, they're being reported that he's 16 miles from Philadelphia with 15,000 men. You'd say, well, that's pretty impressive. But in fact, he's 12 miles from Philadelphia with 24,000 men. And that would even look more impressive at the start of the White Marsh campaign. So, of course, Washington's purposely keeping a huge army that close to Howe to show Howe that there's not going to be any more Brandywines in my future, but there's going to be another Germantown in yours sooner or later, right?
yeah, no, now that's and so in this book too, do you conclude when he's marching into Valley Forge? Where does this volume?
I actually stop. I actually stop with those negotiations in France. It's right at the end of the White Marsh campaign, because all that's happening together. So
Okay,
volume two is going to begin with the march to first the Gulf, which includes the action at Matson's Ford, the Gulf encampment, then Valley Forge, the whole issue with the Cabal, and then almost half of the book is the Monmouth campaign, and then it ends with the 4th of July, 1778. So
yeah, that's great. And you mentioned the size of the army is 24,000. Now that's something I remember you mentioning this to me about, finding that all of this has been greatly underrepresented. How many men Washington actually had? Can you tell us a little bit about, yeah,
right.
how has this been overlooked? I guess because it's typically
Well,
viewed as this smaller army. Yeah.
right. And if I can use, this is the advantage of me bringing my Civil War writing experience into this, because this is something that Civil War historians have hashed out over time, because the same thing happened. What Washington does when he estimates the size of his army isn't much different from what Confederate generals do when they estimate the size of theirs. They look at the number of people that are carrying a gun, right?
Mm-hmm.
So rank and file is usually the number that's depicted. And in the Civil War, for example, it's privates, sergeants, and corporals. And in the Revolution, it only includes privates and corporals, not even the sergeants. There's a whole non-com staff, which includes sergeants and fife and drums. And then the number of staff and field officers are never included in those numbers. So whenever you hear Washington or even historians have picked on this up on this, and they only report on the number of troops as rank and file numbers, that always bothered me for this reason, Mark. If an artillerist, whether it's an officer or private, gets killed on a battlefield, he obviously participated. He got killed, and he's not counted in the numbers. If a captain of infantry goes down in the battle, he's not counted. If a courier who's delivering messages but participating to deliver messages goes down, he's a casualty. If you can be counted as a casualty, you have to be counted as a participant. It always bothered me that never is it has transferred over very well. So when it comes to these numbers, that's part of the problem. There's a factor I use that almost corrects it. It depends on the campaign you're looking at, but if you take a rank and file number and you multiply it by about 1.3, then you get closer to the true number that's actually on the battle. Now, when we're talking about an encampment like at Valley Forge, I'm just shocked that never is done. Everybody believes Washington that he had 8,200 men fit for duty and 2,800 men that weren't fit for duty because of lack of shoes and clothes. And you add those numbers together, and that adds to 11,000. Oh, Washington had 11,000 men at Valley Forge. No, he had 19,000 men at Valley Forge. And in that case, again, Mike Harris and we found 27 returns. 27 returns. And some of these have been published before. Everybody's just ignored them, but we tabled them and published them in the Journal of the American Revolution. And then for the Philadelphia campaign, we found more unpublished returns in the Timothy Pickering papers, and we published them as a separate article. And we even know that the Germantown attacking force, which we used to think was 12 to 14,000 men, we now know that it was 16,500 men that were leading on that attack. So the numbers in many cases can be up as high as 50% higher. It still doesn't change the fact that a certain number of people were carrying a gun, but it also includes people that were participants in battles or in encampments that were part of the experience. You had to feed them, you had to supply them. They would count as casualties if they went down in a battle. So I always count them on a battlefield.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating, and yeah, when you being able to see the actual roles and like items that are overlooked by
Right.
other historians, and it does change your perception of I mean that's a big difference between 11,000 and 19,000 when you're trying to gauge what kind of force they have and
And to appreciate, which is what volume 2 is going to be about. Washington's commissary woes at Valley Forge are 50% greater when you're dealing with 19,000 men than they were when he was talking about 11,000 men, right? Uh, so when you even look at people that are, quote, on command on a return, and as you know, you've probably seen those numbers too, you always think, oh, they're not part of the army, they're away from camp. Well, the adjutant general has figured out on any given day, 60% of them are in camp. They're just doing other duties. They're healthy and they're just detached from their regiment, but they could be called on in an emergency. Well, guess what? You got to feed them. They're going to build a hut. It's not like they sleep in the open, so you got to count them as needing space in a hut. So when Washington's huts are analyzed at 15 to 2,000, I've already done the calculation, and it comes out in volume 2. I think it's more like 2,400. It's an incredible size military city that they create out there with what ends up being the third largest population center in the United States of America for 6 months was Valley Forge. Yeah.
Yeah, it's impressive to try and think about. That's one thing. I mean, yeah, when you're talking that the largest city is 35,000 people, and here you have armies of all these kinds of people for the first time coming together like that. Just
Right.
the
Right.
logistics of it is impressive.
And just the revelation that you're doing this first time military city in history, essentially, with all these huts, and it truly is its own city. Somebody called one of the soldiers would call we're building ourselves a great continental city, and it was just all these log huts essentially. But it really is that impressive. There's that many men, and all the disease that took these guys out was probably because well we now appreciate this with COVID, right? Is that they were in such a small space that 5 square miles for most of them that you can appreciate that when typhoid starts getting spread around in the spring, that's when most of these guys died, not in the winter, but in the spring months. You could see how quickly that would spread between
Yeah.
the huts. Yeah.
And I like you. Yeah, plugging a lot of Mike Harris's stuff. We at Emerging Revolutionary War, we're going to be heading up with Mike Harris is going to be joining us next fall for our annual Emerging Revolutionary War tour. We're going to be doing a
Okay.
bus tour of these sites related to the Philadelphia campaign. I know you mentioned you've done tours up there.
Oh yeah.
Uh, uh, you know, did you do any go to any sites while you were writing this manuscript, or are there any just like what are your favorite spots up there for telling the stories of the Philadelphia campaign?
Well, I
Um,
do. I do a lot of tours, and I do them in different. I've done bus tours, and actually the best ones are the van size groups because you can get them in the smaller spots. One of those hidden gems, and I took Mike to this too. I found the spot where Howe exactly landed the troops in at the head of Elk, and it's not at the point where Elkton is today. It's about 4 more miles down, and you can go into this cul-de-sac into a residential area, and you could do this fairly indiscriminately with a van group, But we were there one time with a tour group, and this woman comes up and she in a golf cart, and she says, "What are you doing?" And we explain what's there, and she didn't know about it. She says, "I got a dock that goes right out into the like a quarter of the way into the water." And we got the experience of walking right out where how ships would have been essentially. So you couldn't beat that. That was pure serendipity on that one. And then just even recently, one of my more recent findings, but I use this in the book as well, is that Mike talked about this right before Germantown. Washington will have this council, an open council in a meadow where he discusses his battle plan with his subordinate generals that have to go down those 4 different roads. Every single brigade commander forms a semicircle around him, and we found the meadow.
oh
I was
wow.
able to I was able to take the account of a 9-year-old boy that talked about this, who Mike uses in his book, and match up his house with an 1850s map of who the house belonged to after. The houses are still standing there, and we were able to find the spot. So it's a great little off the beaten path tour stop. But I would say for 95% of that book, I visited every site, including there I at one time knew this, but all of Washington's headquarters sites, a lot of the original buildings are still standing. Some of them are privately owned. Some of them, of course, are preserved as a historic site. But even where the buildings aren't standing, I know where the sites were. So it was always a little mission of mine. So yeah, I always make sure that I try to visit every single possible site that's explained in the book.
Yeah, I think I've always you could tell reading books if the author is
Yeah,
familiar with the
you can.
landscape. I think that's so important. And like what you're saying, I think a lot of times people think that these significant sites have all been, made state parks or national parks. But a lot of them, like you said, are, in cul-de-sacs and residential areas or in places that people don't know that this important history it happened right where they go every day. They may not even realize how significant
Well,
those.
right, but it also helps for the research and the writing because, for example, Washington will spend 2 weeks on Quaker Hill in Wilmington at a house that no longer stands, and it's only traditionally accepted that way. It was the Jacob Bennett house that's up in a residential area today, but near the Quaker meeting, the old historic Quaker meeting house, 100 yards from it, that's still standing. And there's a report of damage that's done, not intentional damage, but by occupation of Revolutionary War soldiers that during the encampment they were occupying the meeting house, and they were I forget what the exact report is called, but they filed this report. And it didn't make sense to me. Why would Washington just be within 100 yards of soldiers when the rest of his army's on Red Clay Creek 3 miles away? And it finally dawned on me when I went to the site. That would have been his lifeguard that was using the Quaker meeting house. It's the only thing it could have been. And it made perfect sense. They were the ones that were encamped with headquarters. 100 yards away, while Washington and his staff is at the Bennett property. So now it makes perfect sense to me. But not
Yeah.
until I went up, not until I went up there. So
Huh.
could I
Yeah, no,
understand that?
yeah, being in those places and knowing the lay of the land, I think is fantastic. Well, thank you, Gary, for joining us. Now, if people want to get their copy, how can they get a copy of this book?
Well, I think it's still discounted if they get it on Amazon. So I would just suggest they buy it there. I would say though, I mean, it's West Home. I love West Home, but their bindings might be a little weak, so they probably should buy 2 or 3 copies each, so that just so that you don't keep bending it back and forth. You understand that?
You have a
Uh,
field guide, and then you got
yeah,
the
yeah,
last.
that's exactly it. But I think it's in Kindle and in hardcover, but you can get it either way on Amazon. That's probably the best way to go.
Well, yeah, like I said, I think it'd make a great Christmas present, so people can get their copy of this book, and yeah, no, I'm also looking forward to getting a copy of this, and then also for volume 2. Do you have a
Volume two,
timeline?
Volume two is scheduled for release late next spring, so almost exactly 1 year later. I'm almost done writing it, so it should still be on time, but we're looking at probably May or June next year for
Okay,
volume two.
great. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll have to have you back on next year once that comes out to talk about that volume.
appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Everybody go check it out. George Washington's Momentous Year. So volume 1, get your copy today. Thanks,
Thanks
Gary.
a lot, Mark. Thanks for having me on.